I'm Jo Haigh. I am one of the co-directors of the Grantham Institute here at Imperial College. And the Institute exists to encourage and support research, science and engineering and medicine in climate change and environmental activities, and to ensure the impact of that into the real world, and also to help communicate the results to decision makers, which I think is probably the sort of focus that we're on today. So it's a great pleasure for us to be hosting this discussion on the outcomes of COP21. A number from the Grantham Institute, and I'm sure others, attended the COP21 as observers, and it was an extremely exciting event to be at. I mean, as somebody who wasn't involved in the discussions as others here were. And I think, personally, by the end of it, and the decisions came out, I felt that it was a really historic moment. I just thought something has changed here, and this is really, the world moving ahead in the right direction. Now, perhaps I'm an optimist, we'll see, but that sets the scene for what we've got today, which is a discussion on what were the outcomes of COP21, and of course the practical side of things is now what we need to do to get to the low carbon future. So it's a great pleasure to have an eminent panel here who's going to help us discuss this. First of all, Sir David King here on my left, who is the Chief Climate Envoy from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and he was actually at COP as a knowing what he's talking about person involved in the negotiations. Former Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK government. So he's going to set the scene and provide a sort of government perspective. Then we have Josue Tanaka, who is Managing Director of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and he's going to talk about the sort of financial issues and how we can actually afford, or perhaps how this might be organised as it goes forward. Jeff Seabright is Chief Sustainability Officer of Unilever, and he can offer the industrial and business perspective on how companies are going to adapt in this low carbon future. And Neil Thorns is chair of the Climate Coalition, which is a group of NGOs that are all interested in climate issues. So I think we've got a great panel here, and it'll be very interesting to see what they have to say. They're each going to give a short talk. We've allocated David 15 minutes and the other 5 each, after which we'll be open to questions from the floor. So David, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jo. I don't think there's going to be too much disagreement between us on the importance of what happened at the COP process. The date, 12/12/15, I believe and hope that future historians will say that was a major turning point. That was the point where 197 nations decided we need to manage this problem. I'm just showing here a copy of an editorial that I published in Science on the 8th of January. And they put this heading on it, and I rather like that, the biggest opportunity of our age. And that's really what I want to say, that this is for governments and for the business sector and for all of us a massive opportunity. Meeting this challenge, turning it into an opportunity, is really what I want to focus on in my presentation. Now, first of all, let me very quickly cover what happened in COP. The first and most important thing is we shifted from a top-down process, which failed at Copenhagen, to a bottom-up process that got through in Paris. And that bottom-up was determined by nationally determined contributions, each country being asked to say what they would do. Not freely asked. Let me say, I made about 80 official country visits in the run-up to the Paris meeting because peer pressure and ability to use that big international climate fund set up by the British government to back up what we were doing was a critical part of the pathway to Paris. This wasn't just countries volunteering. It was discussions and intense discussions taking place in the run-up to Paris. So we end up with nationally determined contributions And although the sum of the nationally determined contributions does not add up to the other commitments that were made, nevertheless, I'm going to stress the enormous surge in the market pull for renewable energy, for energy storage, for smart grids, for interconnectors that is encompassed within that agreement. 190 nations, each producing a surge in demand, and that demand being met by the private sector. That, to me, is the first and most important outcome of Paris. Now, let me just take you through the agreement, and I don't plan to spend much time on this at all. First of all, the long-term goal, critically important. The intervention from small island states, and I kept saying amongst those states, Britain also is an island state, that was crucial in getting this agreement. We are aiming to be no more than 2 degrees centigrade, actually better than that. 2 degrees centigrade, well below, is the statement in the agreement, and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I'm going to come back and discuss that in a moment. That's a critically important mission that was set by that agreement for all nations to adhere to. And then we had agreements on emissions, a review mechanism, critically important, every 5 years. We're going to review how we're doing by summing up all of these, every country's shift into this low-carbon arena. Finance, we all know, $100 billion a year moving from 2020 from developed nations to developing nations. And what we had before us in Paris was the estimate from the OECD that actually in 2014 the sum was around $63 billion a year already. And one of the key things I want to say is that Paris isn't, of course, the beginning. Paris was an agreement that really amounted to an agreement going forward in time, but from a lot of action that has already been happening. Differentiation was built in. Developed and developing nations, does anyone believe the world is easily divided in two like that? Well, of course it's not. We've got the emerging powers who are very proud to tell us they're emerging powers, unless it means taking action as a developed nation on this issue. And loss and damage. But let me just move on from that. Outside the United Nations Framework Convention, we have a lot of important things happening. And I've just picked out 3 here, and I'm going to dwell on a 4th one in a moment. So the 3 New York Forest Declaration. Why is that important? Well, Britain, working with Norway and Germany to create that declaration, which has now been signed up to by 37 forested nations. And that declaration says, by 2030, all deforestation of natural forests will have come to an end around the world, and we will have reforested an area equivalent to the size of India by that time. We will have created a new carbon sink through that process, which amounts to, roughly speaking, the emissions from the United States per annum today. So quite an important method in achieving the pathway set by the G7 heads of government on June the 8th last year. We commit ourselves to decarbonize the global economy this century, they said, and then followed through by the COP agreement. We need that larger sink to manage to get to neutrality in emissions of greenhouse gases, and I'm going to say very soon. Expansion of carbon pricing activities around the world. The very important thing that's happening there is the European Union is sorting out its carbon pricing process, and I believe by 2020 we will have cracked that. And then China has already got 6 areas of China doing cap and trade, and they're saying by 2017 that will be the whole of China, a market much bigger than the European Union. And I've just come back from Beijing, and we're discussing how we can match up the Chinese and the European Union trading process so that we have a single price for carbon dioxide. And of course, we're going to bring in other areas of the world that are beginning to introduce cap and trade. This is part of bottom up. That's exactly what has happened in the revolution since Copenhagen into Durban. Bottom up means it evolves and countries take ownership of what they're doing. I'm drawing attention to the UK-US agreement that was reached in Paris as well on African development. What we had was the UK developing an Energy Africa policy, and about the same time the US developing a Power Africa policy. So we signed an agreement together, and that agreement says by 2030 we will have rolled out renewable energy to all villages off-grid in Africa, amounting to about 620 million people who today have no access to electricity. Very good for those people, of course. And of course, we have a large aid budget to assist that process, at $18 billion a year at the moment. But what I also want to point out is, here's another big market. And that market pull is going to pull into it a large number of competitors who will pull prices down. And I want to say that's a key to traveling forward in time. By which I mean to say that we will get a self-accelerating process. As renewable energy plus storage plus smart grids come into the marketplace at competitive prices, by which I mean competitive with the mature fossil fuel industry, we will find that things change much more rapidly than you would believe from simply adding up the nationally determined contributions. I think, for me, that's a critically important way forward into the future. Now, let me just deal with where we need to be going. If I'm a bit breathless, it's because 15 minutes is a very short time. Where we need to be going is that green curve. This is annual emissions of carbon dioxide on the vertical scale and time from 1990 to 2035. That's from the IEA estimate going forward in time, the red curve. Where we need to be, and this is a very simple graph, is roughly on that green line. And the hatched area indicates the amount of transition away from fossil fuel over that period of time. Now, as we look at that graph, please, the next one is more complicated simply because there's a summing up of different graphs on it. So it's actually a very similar graph, but it comes post-Paris. So the first part of this graph, you see the emissions on the left-hand side now given as billions of tons of carbon as a function of time from 2010 onwards. The yellow curve, the top curve, indicates by 2030 what those sum of nationally determined contributions mean today. So if every country delivers, we're roughly speaking on that yellow curve. And then if we accelerate beyond that, and I guess this is a best behavior futures curve, you'll see that if we follow that curve, the temperature rise expected is somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees centigrade. So it's not even close to that 2.7 degrees centigrade that is being bandied about. The important thing is the agreement really only goes to 2030. And it's the behavior beyond 2030 that's going to be critically important. But now, let's take the 1.5 degrees centigrade pathway on this graph. That's the one closest to me on this side, is the yellow curve. And that says, to give us an odds-on chance of reaching only 1.5 degrees centigrade, we need to reduce our emissions so that by 2030, we've reached neutrality, right? 2033 or so. So that's an extremely ambitious curve. And then in blue and red, we've got two curves that represent the stretch of understanding to have an odds-on chance of hitting 2 degrees centigrade or better. So we really have committed ourselves in Paris, all countries, to lying between the red and the yellow curves, and yet you can see that the nationally determined contributions are a big stretch away. And the challenge is critically important, which is Paris is only the beginning of a really tough battle for humanity to stay well below the commitments that have been made, even in the commitment period. That's why the review process was so critically important. We need to know the pathway that we're on going forward in time. How am I doing?
5 minutes-ish.
All right, let me just skip that one then. Now, here's a few words of encouragement. Right? So the first thing is that in 2014, globally, we passed the point where 50% of energy installation, primary energy installation, was renewable around the whole world. Right? 51% is the IEA figure for 2014. So we're already seeing this transition occurring. We're not waiting for it to happen. The UK has a surprisingly good record. You may say surprisingly good. We've been focused on this for longer than any other country. And so this transition in the UK has given rise to a new low-carbon sector, which is actually the fastest growing sector in the UK's economy at the moment. 30% growth in the last 3 years, and employing, these are numbers are from not some ropey place. This is from the Business Innovation and Skills Department and the Office of National Statistics. So we're looking at 11,500 companies, keeping employment high. The renewable energy sector is high in employment. 460,000 people, and you'll see the annual turnover, about £120 billion. This is a major contributor to our economic growth. We mustn't skip this over. This is a critically important fact that we all need to hold high as we go forward in time. And the point I'm going to make now is that's only the beginning. The new low-carbon energy sector is going to be worth globally $2 to $3 trillion a year by the time we get to about 2020. So this is the biggest market sector in the world that is emerging very rapidly under our feet. This is the critical graph, right? What we must have is competitive prices. And as the market has grown, we already know that the prices have been pulled down dramatically. The news is about around photovoltaics, but I just point out LED lighting has done much better. So urban lighting and interior lighting dramatically improved in terms of energy efficiency. But if you look at land-based wind, battery costs, etc., the costs are coming down. And we need to focus on how that can be developed. Can new radical technology change the picture going forward? I think it can. I know it can. And so what we need to focus on, and Imperial College is as good a place as any in the world to state this, is let's focus our innovation support on developing the technologies that take us down this route. And a group of us in the UK set out something called the Global Apollo Program. And Mr. Tanaka was there when I first presented this to the United Nations about 2.5 years ago. What we're proposing here has now morphed itself into, and I skipped that, into something called Mission Innovation. It was launched on the first day of the Paris COP. So again, this is outside the United Nations convention negotiating, but is, I think, a critically important pathway. 20 nations have committed to doubling their publicly funded research, development and demonstration into clean energy, clean defined by zero carbon energy, going forward in time. And those 20 nations represent 80% of the world's funding, public funding of RD&D. So this was launched, as you can see, by Obama, Modi, Hollande, and Cameron. Modi was the one who didn't like the name Apollo. He chose the Mission Innovation title. I'm happy with the name. So the rollout, we're hoping, will be completed in June this year at the Clean Energy Ministerial meeting due in San Francisco at that time. And alongside this, I had Bill Gates calling me up and saying, I'm prepared to put $1 billion on the table, not as philanthropic money to be added to the public money, but as my private investment money into the new technologies that emerged, to stimulate them into the marketplace. He then turned up in Paris with 26 billionaire friends, having each promised to do roughly the same. There's a total of $20 billion investment capital there, sitting, waiting for the new technologies to flow out of this Mission Innovation Program. That's very exciting, because as these reach into the marketplace, we're going to see dramatic changes. All the photovoltaics in the world, and this is a recent announcement from South Africa, here's the big market emerging. 9.6 gigawatts in South Africa being just announced. Modi has announced 100 gigawatts in China. We've got a very big market emerging. But what about the technologies that aren't yet in the marketplace? This is an energy storage technology developed by Professor Haigh in response to these discussions, in which he's using up-pumped water technology to raise a large cylinder of granite, that's 150 meters diameter, 250 meters deep, storing a gigawatt hour of electricity. Right? So you pump the water up when you've got excess electricity, and then squeeze the water through turbines to create a current as you need it. Now, these are the ideas that I see into the future that are going to be transformative. This is a British company that has got an airship that will carry 1,500 tons of freight. It's quite big. It measures 170 meters long and about 70 meters wide, 12 stories high, and its size is a big advantage. It's got 12 helium bags inside it. It's got a helium cylinder. It's got a compressor, and it's got a crane. Essentially, once you've got this airborne, by releasing helium into the cylinder, lifting 1,500 tons, if you like, or you use the crane to lift any freight up into the vehicle when it's airborne. And equally, you lower onto the land without landing the vehicle. So you pick up tomatoes from tomato fields in Spain in a crate, and you carry them to Britain, and you lower them from the air onto the Sainsbury's and Tesco's depots. How does it translate itself? It's got a very large solar intersection, as I'm sure you've guessed. So it's covered with photovoltaics. Those are electric motors, and it can travel at 340 kilometers an hour because it's flying at 30,000 feet. So what you're looking at is a potential. I have to say this is a photoshopped vision. It's a potential for which would be a major breakthrough as we go forward in time. And I just leave you with that. We've got enormous opportunities represented by this major transition as we emerge from this fossil fuel age. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that inspirational start to our discussion. Now we'll move on to finance. This is the tough stuff, isn't it? Yes, Josue.
So, good evening, everybody. And I think what I'll try to do is to take this inspiration and then see, I would say, in the short term, what can we do and what seems to emerge from COP21 that allows us to move towards that inspiration. First of all, maybe just one word of perspective, from which perspective am I addressing you? Essentially, we're a development bank. We work in Eastern Europe and North Africa, the Middle East, about 37 countries. We finance about 150 climate projects per year, both mitigation projects as well as adaptation. It's about equivalent $3 billion a year of our financing, and it accounts for about 30% of total investment of the institution, about 64% of this in the private sector. So that's essentially the angle from which I will be taking, I would say, what are the points that emerge from COP21 from our perspective. I thank for the opportunity to be able to think about this, because in our business with all these projects, sometimes you don't have time to step back. And I think, coming here this evening has kind of forced me, to step back and give you, at least our vision as to what COP21 means going forward. Perhaps one element, because in stepping back, I have looked at research that has been done by Imperial and the Grantham, I think if I'm correct, Avoid 2, right, is the name of the research project. And because, financiers like scientists like numbers, I just want to put two numbers to you that I retained from this study, which is essentially this notion of the budget, right? What is the carbon budget that remains? And if I remember correctly, the amount is 1,000 gigatons, right? And we are emitting roughly 55 today, I think, per year. So you can all divide that if you are to stay, within 2 degrees, it's not an infinite amount of time in which, that we have to address the issue, because essentially 1,000 divided by 55 is less than 20 years. Right? So I think that sense of urgency is something, that, we need, I think, to keep in mind. My analogy for COP21 from a practical perspective, not because I'm a very bookish guy, but is essentially a book in which the end of the story has been specified, and Sir David King presented it. It's the 2 degrees and the extra ambition of 1.5, in which many of the titles, like a Charles Dickens novel, have been written. So we know that in certain chapters, this is what needs to happen. But then how much has been written of each chapter varies. Some of the chapters are rather empty, and some of the other chapters already have quite a lot, because as you mentioned already, we've been working at this for quite a while. So let me try to move through some of these chapters that matter from a finance point of view. I think the first one, and probably the most important, the way we see it, is really asking the question, what is the price signal that emerges from COP21? How clear? Has it improved? Has it become sharper? Has it given a direction? Has it given a time frame for that price signal? Again, I think just so that we have a good discussion, I won't give you the answer. But the point is, I think that's a key question. Because you made the point about the reduction in cost, which is crucial. But in many aspects, unless carbon starts having a price, or at least you start reducing the level of subsidies to fossil fuel, the whole incentive framework is wrong, right? And it makes, for those technologies, extra room, they have to reduce their cost even more to be able to address those distortions. So that's the first point I would put there. The second point has been very much about financing, because in the negotiations, financing has both a relevance in terms of making projects happen, but it also has a political dimension. I won't get into the political dimension, because that's not really what we do, but in terms of the financing, we all know that in order for this agreement to stick, we are going to have, within the next 5 years, to show that Paris is delivering some difference in as many countries as we can. And that essentially what is the mission, in a way, that we emerge from Paris with, which is use this framework of the book in order to do the most that we can in as many countries as we can. Then the focus shifts very much to actions on the ground. And there I would say 2 things related to the agreement. One, Sir David King mentioned the INDCs, right? So these are these contributions that the governments have stated and submitted ahead of COP21. Okay, that's great. We need to use those frames. Actually, right now, my staff is analyzing every single one of every single of our countries, and we are trying to classify them as good INDC, with precision. We know what it's saying, all the way to INDCs that are just a statement of general intent. But the point is, we shouldn't stop there. We should also take the opportunity of this to work with the countries to advance, if you want, the state of definition of those INDCs, so they become a frame, if you want, for action and investment. So that's the first point, is the work through the INDCs. The second element of Paris that I think is very important, and I think was part of the, if I could say, the cleverness of the way Paris was approached, was you had the political negotiation, the negotiations part, but you also had a huge level of mobilization, in terms of what was called the Lima Paris Action Agenda, if I remember correct, the LPAA, also something to do with the Nazca lines, but I think it was essentially a huge mobilization, and Jeff may talk about this because he is part of that, right, because it's not over yet, but essentially mobilizing hundreds of corporates, thousands of cities, in order to come from the bottom with proposals. So the next challenge for us financiers is also how do you support that? Because that thing supported is a huge way, to create confidence in the system going forward. If we disappoint, right, in other words, all those ideas stay there on the shelf and don't move, we're going to have a problem, right? And particularly when you mentioned this 5-year review, the way we look at it is we better have done a lot by the next 5 years in order to even have the possibility. I believe we have to ratchet up, right? Because your curves show that what we have today is not yet enough. There are some other points. Maybe the last one I would mention because of time is the point of the MRVs, the monitoring, reporting, verification. That to us is also key, and it's one of the chapters of the book that's also been left relatively, for now, impressionistic. But yet it's key, because if you can't actually measure exactly what's going on, then how do you define, the ratcheting? So I'll stop here, maybe with one line or half of a line from my discussions in Paris last week with the COP21 colleagues on, first, have you rested during the holidays? And number two, how do you look at things? Their expression was very much the end of the beginning, that Paris was, the end of the beginning. And I think, we are discussing a lot of the points that happen after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jeff.
Well, thank you very much, and pleased to be here, honored to be here today. It says, my title says Chief Sustainability Officer. That's what it says on my business card, but for those of you who know or have seen our Chief Executive Officer, Paul Pullman, know that that's a lie. He's actually the Chief Sustainability Officer at Unilever. I think, clearly, I think we're all very excited about what was, in many ways, a surprising success at Paris. I don't think anybody felt that we would see 1.5 degrees end up in the agreement. The pledge and review commitment's very strong, et cetera. And I think the lead French negotiator, Laurence Toubiana, who led this effort brilliantly with the Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, a year ago said that success at Paris would be measured by whether the shift to the post-fossil fuel age is seen as inevitable as a result of this agreement. And I think by most measures, that probably is the case. In fact, I'd say if you fast forward 10 years from now and look back on 2015, it will be seen as a watershed year. I mean, we've had the coming together of the climate and development agenda and the sustainable development goals, a critical unlock, because we can't address climate without addressing the development agenda and vice versa. We saw the Pope's encyclical, the US and China moving, divestment movement. I mean, it really was an extraordinary year, a culmination of quite a few things coming together to create a true tipping point, a real watershed year. I think the outstanding question, and I think Sir David touched on it, is will it be fast enough? So we've come together, we've established a framework, we have a plan, but are we going to move with speed and dispatch in order to address the urgency that we're now facing based on the science that is evident? I just want to say a few words about the role of business, both in the lead up very briefly and then more importantly on sort of the follow through the road from Paris. I think it was the case, and I've been involved in COPs for longer than I care to remember. I was part of the US team negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, to give a sense of perspective. That business played an extraordinary role in being an advocate for an ambitious agreement. Not all businesses, clearly, but more and more, the business community, I think, came together and effectively helped de-risk the political process by making it possible to step out and take on these challenges. 4,000 companies now globally report their emissions. 1,000 last year called for a carbon pricing regime. 150 companies with a market cap of $7 trillion in the US, where this is a polemical and polarizing issue in many ways, came together with the American Climate Action Pledge to support ambitious action through a whole host of acronym soup kinds of organizations: the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the UN Global Compact, the World Economic Forum, and a coalition of NGOs and business associations that came together under the banner of We Mean Business. And I think together it really did help move the agenda forward. Having said that, the outcome in Paris, in terms of the nationally determined contributions, when you add them up, don't get us anywhere near 2 degrees, much less 1.5 degrees. It's a good down payment on where we need to go. But the remainder of that is going to have to be, we're going to have to accelerate our ambition if we're going to stay within the realm of avoiding kind of catastrophic implications, which I think means that the business community is going to need to step up. The business and finance community is going to need to step up to further raise the level of ambition. So we have a good agreement in place, but I think business can play, a really critical role. Sir David talked about the shift in market pull. That signal was clearly sent in Paris, and I think the next 2 years are going to be really critical for us to accelerate that ambition, because in 2 years, a little over 2 years' time, countries are going to begin looking at the review process. And if we in the business community and the finance community together can help raise the level of ambition, I think we can help ratchet up, which is what we need to do, our collective efforts. And I think this really happens in 2 ways, and we've just heard on finance. Finance is the oxygen of market economies, and getting from billions to trillions is going to be critical. The World Economic Forum, I think, has projected that shifting to a low zero carbon economy is going to require, $5 to $6 trillion of annual investment to make that transition. That makes ODA, official development aid, and the kinds of investments that national governments are making trivial in comparison to the magnitude of what's going to be required. So we have to tap into and mobilize private financial markets. I think there's also a huge opportunity for business, and Sir David also touched on this, to really affect transformational change in key sectors. So the New York Declaration on Forests, and Unilever was very involved in that effort to really lay out a blueprint for changing the way we approach commodity and supply chains and their impact on forests, and working with governments and indigenous peoples organizations and NGOs and other businesses to drive a vision of driving a 50% reduction in rates of deforestation and ending tropical deforestation by 2030. That's a transformational agenda. There are transformational agendas that have to happen in energy efficiency, in materials, in agriculture, and many more. And those are the kinds of things that individual companies can help contribute to, but I think companies working together across sectors in a pre-competitive fashion can really help drive ambition much more aggressively, and that's what it's going to take. So I think making markets work faster to help deliver the low-carbon climate economy that we need is going to be critical, and I think the next 2 years will be very essential in that effort. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you. Neil.
So thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm going to show you a short film at the end. So hopefully we've got that kind of queued up. But I was just going to take you through just a couple of the kind of positives from a civil society point of view. So I chair, as Joe said, the Climate Coalition, which people may not be familiar with, but you'll be familiar with the members of it. So you'll have heard of World Wildlife Fund, WWF, Oxfam, Greenpeace, the Women's Institute, the National Trust. They all come together under this Climate Coalition. So over 130 organisations, adding up to around 12 million supporters. So I can't speak on behalf of every one of them, because as you can imagine, it's a diverse coalition, but it does actually represent, I think, one of the ways that civil society played a key role in actually the Paris Agreement. So I'm just going to touch a bit on the kind of some of the positives, slight kind of reality check about where we are, but actually it still gives us a way of moving forward, and then just how we're going to kind of push forward on Paris. So I think the first thing to say is how you think kind of the success of Paris is what your expectations of Paris were going into it. And I think as Jeff said, actually, I don't think anyone particularly beforehand would have thought that Paris would have come up with what it did. And for those of us who were there at Copenhagen and remembering the kind of failure that came out of Copenhagen, certainly from a civil society point of view, that blew a massive hole within the kind of climate movement, and it felt that there was really nowhere to kind of go from there. So actually, I think the important thing was from Paris that we had a kind of place to move on from, and we've got a place to build ambition from. And as you've heard from people, I think that's really key in the fact of we've got 1.5 degrees, it's more ambitious, we've got a mechanism which brings countries back to the table to increase that ambition. And we have, as Jeff said, a signal in the sense of the end of the fossil fuel era, which I think is really important. But when you think about those kind of top line figures, when we talk about the 1.5 degrees, I think the thing from our perspective is that you have to think about the people behind those figures. So actually 1.5 degrees, it's nice to talk about the fact that we need to get there quicker. Actually, that is a matter of survival for some people in small island states and vulnerable countries. So actually, when we look at the graphs and we look at the figures, we have to put the people's faces behind that and realize that these are people's lives that we're talking about, and that's where we need the ambition to move forward. I think the other thing that we need to think about is the fact of we're already in a kind of 1 degree temperature rise, and you look at the humanitarian impacts that are happening across the world because of that already, and the fact that the humanitarian system just can't cope with the numbers. So you look at the flooding in the UK, or you look across the world in terms of whether that's droughts, whether that's floods, whether it's whatever natural disasters which are happening. And I think that takes you to the point of in the Paris Agreement, the finance was kind of there, but actually the finance wasn't there enough. So actually rich countries didn't step up to the kind of mark in terms of around the finance area. And the important thing around finance is it needs to go towards adaptation and not just about mitigation. And that was one of the key potential problems coming out of Paris, which we need to build on. It's not disastrous, but it's something that we need to kind of build on going forward. And I have to say the UK government is one of the better, if not the best, ones around adaptation funding. So all credit to them. I think then the other thing that we just have to think about is planetary boundaries. So when we talk about the aspects of kind of technology, we have to think that for the average footprint of someone in the richest 1% is around 175 times greater than that of the person living in the poorest 50%. So that's a massive footprint that we have. So we need to think about how we live our lives. It's not going to be possible to do business as usual. We need a shift and a change in terms of how we do it. So in terms of, I think, how civil society, I think, plays a role in that. As you've heard from the NDCs, actually that's the important thing. So we can come back to our countries and we can actually say, what are the policies and what are the practices that we need to do to look at making ourselves achieve that 1.5 degree world? So if you like, finance ministers across the world should be looking at all of the policies coming across their desks and saying, is that compatible with a 1.5 degree world? How are we going to get there? So I think there's a real potential for us to kind of move forward on that from a bottom-up process. I think the second thing is about that we can breathe life into these political moments. We've got a Paris Agreement which does give us a way forward. And as civil society, we have to breathe life into those political moments because that's where the change happens. We know that from negotiators and others. And then in the UK, I'll just say one last statistic and then I'll show you the film. So in the UK, 75% of people support renewable energy. But of those 75% of people, only 9% believe 75% support renewable energy. So actually, the job that we have to do is actually to demonstrate the fact that there is a lot of support for this going forward. And this is one of the key ways that we're going to do it, if we can show the film. Oh, do I need to get up? Okay, so just while we're doing it, this is a film which we produced for Valentine's Day. So this is last year's Valentine's Day film. And I would just quickly describe to you next one.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely, and more temperate.
Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date.
Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines,
and oft is his gold complexion dimmed.
And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed.
But thy eternal summer shall not fade,
Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest.
Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade.
When in eternal lines to time thou growest.
so long as men can breathe or eyes can see.
So long lives this.
And this gives life
to me.
So this year's film, which you'll be able to see by the end of this week on Facebook, is written by Michael Mopogo and stars Jeremy Irons and Maxine Peake. And the important thing is it's about demonstrating the things which you care about, which are going to be threatened by climate change. And I can talk about a lot more about the kind of the way that our campaign is going to take it forward. But it's important for people to make their voice known and to do it on a national level all around the world. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we can now take questions from the floor. I'd like to take 3 in a go, and please will you say your name and affiliation, and also please keep your questions short. Thank you. So over there on the right.
The most inaccessible person.
Yeah, this lecture theatre is a slightly odd design.
Yes, good evening. Vincent Gilles, Credit Suisse. So I'm a banker. I'm going to talk about finance. 2 questions. The first one is, when you take a look at the cost of carbon tonight, which is somewhere between 6 and 7 euros per ton, how quickly do you think we're going to get a price signal that will actually be a proper incentive for industries to start getting out of fossil fuel and genuinely into cleaner energy? What we've seen over the last 10 years is the cost of renewable energies have gone down, wind, solar, etc. And unfortunately, in the last 6 months, the cost of fossil fuel has gone down so much that now, unfortunately, the equation has completely changed. That's question number 1. Question number 2 is on returns. The private sector may talk a lot about investing in cleaner energies, but the returns are pretty poor. And I'd like to have your opinion on how you actually improve the returns without having the governments putting money into projects to make them look profitable enough for the private sector to invest in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very clear. It's in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nikki Percival. I work in policy, energy policy for Ofgem, but I'm also an oceanographer. My question is, although it's very interesting to talk about how this is going to work in practice, and obviously that's very important, but when we talk about 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, how do we know that what we're putting into practice is actually scientifically possible to reach that target?
Yes.
I'm Heather Graven from Imperial College. I was wondering about your expectations for the 5-year review process and what are the opportunities or potential problems with the approach?
Thank you. Good. Well, it's a nice range of questions there. We've got questions on how carbon price is going to work. Can we believe the science? And how's the reviews going to work? So shall we do the financing first, Josue?
Okay. Well, I think you asked 2 questions. On the first question, how long is it going to take, is essentially my point about the book, the chapter that is called, price signals must be clear, and what is in that chapter. You're absolutely right in pointing out that carbon markets are not sending at this stage any signal, right? You're absolutely right also in mentioning, the decline, rapid decline of the cost, of oil. So my answer to you is the following: that number one, in our business, right, I use a bit of a mathematical expression to explain what we try to do, which is, I think in mathematics, the notion of maximin. So trying to do the most we can within a policy environment that today, in spite of Paris, remains, in many of the countries that we work, quite minimal. And you can still do things, right? So for example, energy efficiency is something that we invest a lot in. It is quite labor intensive to define those projects, but you can find, even with low energy, fossil fuel prices, you still find projects that are quote unquote profitable and have a return. Now, the point is that the more that boundary of possibilities increase, in particular, with price signals that will move, the more investment will move in. And I think, to me, that's one of the key questions, going forward, right? And it's your question: how fast is that going to move? So you have an equation in which you have what Sir David mentioned, decrease in the cost of technologies. You have a context on the price side, signal that right now is still, in my view, very difficult, particularly in the countries where we work with, where you can have, subsidies to fossil fuel, 30, 40, 50%, and obviously then the IRRs that you have for those projects, very hard, okay? But even like this, we manage. So that's what I mean, by the maximin. Now, the second answer is actually also a bit of a response to your first point of what we can do, is we see very much a relationship between the weakness of the policy framework and particularly of the price signal and the requirements for concessional funding of a public source. So what do I mean by this? The weaker the price signal to the market, if you want to do things and if you want to, the more resource you need from the public sector in order to, I think the expression has been used, either de-risk or mitigate the risk, or what you mentioned was your question, enhance the return of something that at this stage may not yet meet, the threshold. So we, in the discussions we're having actually right now, we are putting this question of the access to concessional funding in this equation of moving fast within a policy environment that's moving at this stage, at least rather slowly, as a key question. Thank you.
Thank you. David, did you want to try the 5-year review question?
Yes, perhaps first of all, the 2 degrees centigrade, is it scientifically possible?
Yes, yes.
And I want to say, I don't know. So in other words, when I was chief scientific advisor, I had to worry about issues that looked as if they had a very remote possibility of happening, but would have an enormous impact on the population of the British Isles. So the trouble with the 2 degrees and the 1.5 degrees centigrade options are we're relying very heavily on a lot of luck in terms of the probability distribution functions representing the best that knowledge can tell you about the pathways into the future. So there is a real, it's a very, very good question. What we haven't heard any discussion of yet, and I'm usually the last person to raise this, is geoengineering. Right? So somewhere in our back pocket, and I must insist it is in the back pocket, is the possibility of reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and there are ways of doing this. Increasing carbon sinks by reforestation is one way of doing that. And when we look at the issue of geoengineering, there are many projects that have been discussed that ought to be, in my view, put under a moratorium by the United Nations, pushing sulfates into the upper atmosphere is a big mistake. We don't know what the unintended consequences would be. But if you take the proposition by the engineer Salter that we send sailing boats around the world puffing seawater into the atmosphere to create clouds that are reflecting, these are the sort of ideas that we actually need to examine going forward in time. We've got to give all these options a chance. But the first and most important thing we have to do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions as much as we feasibly can. And that doesn't sound very scientific to me or to you, I know. Now, the 5-year review process, what can we expect? Well, in a sense, we're already into that process. The graph I showed was an analysis of the nationally determined contributions and shows the gap that we need to close to meet that ambitious target of 2 degrees, or even keep the 1.5 degrees in sight, perhaps with a bit of luck. So, in other words, I'm saying that review process is a very real process, and we've started it already. And in the discussions that I'm having with countries around the world post-Paris, this is very much high on the agenda. How can we achieve more than countries are promising? And you know, we come to an issue that cuts right across carbon pricing, and that is the subsidies for fossil fuels. Yeah. You know, if you've got $500 billion a year of subsidies for fossil fuel and only $100 billion a year for subsidies for renewables, you've got it all the wrong way around. So we've got a big battle on our hands to make that transition happen. And all I can say is, and we've got to do it.
Does any other panelists want to comment on those questions? Or?
Yeah, I would just on the returns on renewable energy. My company Unilever has made a commitment to be 100% renewable electricity by 2020 and 100% renewable energy, including thermal energy, by 2030. And by our calculations, that's going to be a cost-effective transition. But we're doing it at scale, and we're doing it with very creditworthy access to finance. And I think those are the two elements that need to come into play, which is scale. And there are now, I think, 53 major companies that are part of RE100, from Walmart and Google to Unilever and Procter & Gamble, who are making commitments to become 100% powered by renewable energy. And by getting that kind of scale and aggregated demand in the marketplace, we can help bring costs down. And I think the terms of finance, obviously, are critically important. Solar energy in India, the cost of finance alone adds 25 to 30% to solar energy in India, because the terms are simply more challenging. So if we can crack the demand side, the aggregate demand, and more effective and efficient financing to help markets work more effectively, I think that'll be a big step forward.
Okay.
Yeah, just one comment and then one thing for you to think about related to points that have been made. So on the mechanism, the review mechanism, certainly our view on this is 2 ingredients at least are key. One is action and results within the 5-year period in country, because that is what's going to build the confidence in countries of what it means to them, and therefore provides a base for the next 5-year period. The other thing is what I refer to as the MRV, which is basically being able to measure, because if you cannot really measure, then that's also an issue. And the point for you to think about is the following. One of the discussions right now is what advantage can be taken from the low oil prices in the topic that we're discussing. And certainly one of them is that it should facilitate the reduction and even the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Now, easy to say, more difficult to do politically, but certainly as an opportunity, it is a moment, and it is one of those litmus tests where we can see whether the COP21 momentum can actually lead to results in this area.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, in the middle at the back.
Yeah, John Gibbons, UK CCS Research Centre. So, a very quick observation. It's interesting that CCS gets even less mention than geoengineering. I think it might be a bit of the way to go before we get rid of fossil fuels entirely. But the question I've got, I think, much more serious. We've heard a mention of 1 trillion tonnes of CO2 left to emit. And we've also heard about tension between developed and developing countries. Does the panel want to have any ideas about how we would divide this 1 trillion tonnes up between the different countries in the world, the remaining 1 trillion tonnes? And if we're unable to do that, do you think it's possible to actually stick globally within that limit?
Thank you. And there's a question down here. Sorry, I'm sorry, it was a lady at the...
Thank you very much. I'm Joni Pegram from UNICEF UK. Climate change has been described as the greatest human rights challenge of our time. And the Paris Agreement delivered a strong reference to human rights obligations applying in the context of climate action. There was an unprecedented coalition of CSOs and various organisations calling for this. I would like to know, perhaps David King, you could comment on how you see this being implemented in practice going forwards. How do we ensure coherence between our human rights obligations on the one hand, in the international sort of framework for those, and climate policies and actions, making sure that those are kind of ingrained as considerations. And I think the UK has a key role to play as a member of the Human Rights Council, which has been vocal on the issue of climate change, but also having signed up to the UK, up to the Geneva Pledge, which is an intergovernmental initiative looking at this. And obviously this has implications in terms of the SDGs implementation. And you know, I'd also be interested perhaps in kind of looking at how the private sector sees its role taking this forward in terms of mitigation, adaptation investments, and how human rights applies in that, but also multilateral development banks too. Thanks.
Thank you. And then there was one back there. Sorry, Christiane, I met you go running up and down the stairs.
Hello, I'm Tamara Inkster-Draper from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group. Thank you all for your thoughts. You all mentioned the importance of the bottom-up movement and the groundswell there for securing the Paris Agreement. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how we can continue harnessing that momentum to deliver things like a clear price signal and more business commitments and clear communications about the importance of this work.
Thank you. So we have how to divide the 1 trillion tonnes up. We've already had half the 1 trillion tonnes, so I'm just only going to divide the other half of the 1 trillion tonnes up. Human rights and coherence on policy there, and also how to keep the momentum going. So 3 very good, solid questions there. Which one shall we do first? Do you want to do that?
I'm happy to take any one of them. The division of the remaining half of the 1 trillion tonnes that we can emit. I think that my answer to this is the following. By the time we get to 2050, we should have reduced emissions per person around the planet to less than 1.5 tonnes per person if we are going to manage this problem. The figures I showed you show it's considerably less, but let me stay with that figure. And the British government, in announcing a reduction by 80% by 2050, was keeping that principle of equity in mind. I know, I was in that process. Because we were emitting 10 tonnes per person per annum in 1990, and if we get to 2050, we would be at 2 tonnes per person per annum. Now we are, of course, being asked to do more than that, and I believe that we have to take that on board. In other words, that principle of equity applies in the way I'm presenting it as going forward tonnes per person per annum, so that we reach a common point of arrival at a date into the future, and I was suggesting 2050 was that date. Just a quick point on human rights obligations. I think the $100 billion a year, of course, is intended to address that. Just to say, the Green Climate Fund sitting in Seoul is standing at only $10.2 billion dollars today. But compare that with our International Climate Fund, the British International Climate Fund, which is standing at a total of £10 billion today. So we've just got to bear in mind that there isn't only one source of funding from the developed to the developing world. And I think that's a critically important factor. That $63 billion, it includes what the World Bank is funding, it includes what the European Bank is funding. It's a sum over all of the sources that we're looking at. Now, that British International Climate Fund I can talk about. 20% of it so far has been spent on that avoided deforestation issue and reforestation, and roughly 40% on mitigation and 40% on adaptation. And I think you heard Neil say that Britain was probably doing rather better than most countries in the world in including 50-50 adaptation and mitigation. Harnessing the momentum, the final point. What is my biggest worry as I sit here at this point in time? It is just the opposite of momentum, that governments around the world say, thank goodness we've reached an agreement in Paris. Now we can walk away from that awful long-range problem and get on with the issues of today. And if that happens, then of course we will not manage the future for our civilization. So yes, we will have to work extremely hard to see that the magnificent momentum generated from all sectors up to and leading and including the Paris meeting is regenerated and rekindled going forward in time.
Neil, did you want to say anything on human rights, or is that...
No, I would only agree with the UNICEF point. But I mean, the one thing I would just say about so absolutely agree on human rights. But on the question about how you divide up the kind of the trillion tons, I think that comes back to the fact of, as we see often with these cases, it will be the poorest countries who will undoubtedly lose out. And so I think holding on to some sense of the differentiation about this common but differentiated responsibility is really important kind of going forward. So I know that, as David said, it is difficult to kind of draw a line about where that lands any time, but I think we need to hold on to the principle of it. And I'll just finish on the momentum question, because I think actually it's a really crucial one, and I think the biggest danger that we've got is inertia, as Sir David said. And I think for us in this country, we need to be thinking about the 5th carbon budget, which has to come up in June. We need to be thinking about how we're pushing the EU to increase its ambition around it. And of course, absolutely the kind of the vote about whether the UK stays within the EU is absolutely going to be crucial to huge amounts of this, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you. Josue.
Yeah, also on this momentum, I think, just to give you one illustration, because sometimes concrete things, talk. To me, one of the most amazing moments of my presence there in COP21 was actually the meeting of the mayors. There were roughly 1,200 mayors from around the world in the City Hall of Paris in one place, right? And unbelievable mobilization, unbelievable will, to do things. Now, some of you that are cynical will say, well, all mayors always have things that they want to finance. But the point is that they came there to Paris, in terms of climate finance, improving the environment of their cities, etc. So for us, that question, the answer, how do you maintain the momentum, is okay, how many of these projects that these cities are sitting have defined or are defining, how many of these projects have been implemented 5 years from now? That's one element of the momentum, and I think that is our common responsibility to try to do as much as we can in that.
Jeff.
Yeah, just quickly on the human rights, and Mary Robinson has been a tremendous advocate and voice on this issue, and it did receive good attention in Paris, not as much as some would hope, as you probably well know. But I think this notion of the SDGs and climate, and I just came back from Davos, where the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in September and the climate agreement in Paris were basically treated as flip sides of one coin, right? Because we can't really divorce the climate agenda from the development agenda. It's kind of zero carbon, zero poverty, and we're not going to get one without the other. As I think Nick Stern, who stood on this podium several months ago talking about the new climate economy, I think made that pretty clear. So for businesses, I think that the real challenge is how to really understand what that means. So it's not just a carbon equation. It's also about understanding how to unlock some of the key business opportunities at the base of the pyramid around developing and emerging markets. And in that vein, in Davos, we announced the creation of a Commission on Business and Sustainable Development. Lord Mark Malloch Brown will be co-chairing that. That will really work with key leaders in the business community to drive home the big prize, the big opportunity for focusing on addressing these huge challenges of our lifetimes, which is the development and climate nexus. And I think human rights underpins all of that and as a given. So I think that's going to be key.
I just want to chip in because there's an issue that really you've just touched on, but we really need to develop, and that is the co-benefits of going down the clean energy route. One of the massive co-benefits, of course, is for countries like China and India, where the cities, the urban environment, is actually unbelievably hostile to live in many of those cities, you're seeing people losing 15 years on their lifespan because of the poor quality of the air they're breathing. And it's C2.5 particulate matter in particular, but it's other products from coal burning that is driving this forward. The way that China is moving now, it was originally believed they would peak in coal usage in 2020. They made that as their intention. The figures emerging now indicate that they peaked in 2014. They used less coal in 2015, 2.8% less, and we believe that will continue on a downward trend. They are closing down coal-fired power stations, driven not so much, I have to admit, by climate change, but more by this co-benefit, the health benefits. When I travel to countries that are coal producers, I do take the trouble to try and meet up with trade unionists because there is a real issue around coal miners losing jobs as we argue that we should leave coal in the ground. And really the issue for trade unionists who work with coal miners is, in my belief, shift them out of the coal mines. This is the filthiest, most dangerous job around. And get them to retrain them to work on renewable energy, clean energy sources. We don't use the word clean only in connection with zero CO2 emissions. It is a clean energy product with all sorts of co-benefits.
Well, I'm afraid we've got past 7 o'clock, which is when we're meant to finish. I can't take any more questions, which is rather disappointing because it's such a good discussion. But I'd just like to thank you all for coming and contributing, and thank you very much to our 4 eminent and very interesting panellists for a really interesting evening. Thank you.